did you guys see the trailer for Spider-Man 2, like the new Spider-Man game? Here's a funny thing. I was under the impression, I don't know why I thought this, but I felt like Spider-Man Miles Morales was basically Spider-Man 2. And then like at the PlayStation announcement, right, the whole PlayStation event, they're like, Spider-Man 2 is gonna have Miles Morales and Spider-Man facing off against Venom. And I was like, what? And then I started thinking, I was like, yeah, I guess it wasn't really called Spider-Man 2. I guess it was just Spider-Man Miles Morales. That's awesome, right? So I'm really excited about that game. Like, I am so hyped about that game. So having said that, we are continuing on with the Amazing Spider-Man Dan Slott's run. We're finally finishing this after like 2 years. And this is the Osborn identity, right? This is the return of Norman Osborn. Now, here's the funny thing about this, is this whole thing picks up basically with like a big, drug run, a big drug trade that's taking place here, right? Now, one of the things to keep in mind, this is one of the things to remember, is that part of the reason why Spider-Man is here in Delvadia is that while it is a foreign country, Parker Industries is basically kind of a global initiative. So while Peter Parker is still kind of the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, he still deals with threats that are credible that have impacts on New York City and America itself when things go on abroad. The other reason for why he's here is he's hunting Norman Osborn. Now we'll get to that here in a second, but the important thing is while they're there, there's two things happening at the same time. The first is that you basically have Spider-Man and you have Bobby Morris, right? Like Mockingbird, a lot of you guys know her. She's a SHIELD agent because again, Parker Industries, especially Spider-Man himself, kind of has a loose affiliation with SHIELD in the sense of like they're kind of working together. Not all the time, but him and Mockingbird kind of have a thing going on, and we'll actually see where that leads to as we continue to cover Dan Slott's stories. But in this instance, you've got them who are basically here trying to hunt Norman Osborn at the same time dealing with this big drug trade because this is where this road has basically led them. And then you've also got somebody else here. And the funny thing is that while there are like armed guards that are standing outside this drug den where things are going down, that this person who's basically cloaked ends up taking these guys out. Now, here's the important thing about this. The Spider Tracker software, the Spider bots of Peter Parker, as they were developed by Dr. Octopus during the Superior Spider-Man storyline, are highly capable, and they can detect pretty much anybody anywhere within a general vicinity, regardless of how well they're hidden. This particular person knows how to overcome that stuff, which means it tells us right off the bat, this particular person is very adept when it comes to using different forms of tech. And so ultimately, because of the fact that these guards are taken out by this invisible person, that there is a little bit of indication as far as Mockingbird and them go that like, hey, like, was there somebody there? Like, I thought this whole area was clear. And the response of Peter is no, the bots say the area is clear, the whole place is clear, there's nobody there, right? So again, able to overcome Peter's abilities. Now, the other part about this is that you've got Nick Fury who's kind of watching things, at least from the direction of where S.H.I.E.L.D. is coming from, and he's also kind of feeding Peter Parker information, right? Because as capable as Bobby Morris is as a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, at the end of the day, having Nick Fury as kind of the eye in the sky really helps things out immensely, right? Because Nick Fury is highly capable. I mean, he is the director of S.H.I.E.L.D., right? So he has that position for a reason. Now, the question as to how it is they managed to find Norman Osborn, why they're hunting Norman Osborn, and what's going on with this character, let's go ahead and answer this. So the idea is that if you guys recall in our last video where we did the clone conspiracy and that Kingpin gave Peter Parker information that would lead him to the location of the Jackal, that Kingpin's initial response is that in doing this, you're gonna owe me a favor. And the response of Peter was no. The Jackal basically initiated a personal assault on you by resurrecting your dead wife and presenting her to you as what he thought was a peace offering. You took that as a high level of offense. So you want the Jackal destroyed probably more than I do. So I'm gonna take this information, I'm gonna bring down the Jackal, but you, Kingpin, are gonna owe me a favor. And ultimately, Kingpin's a man of his word. That's one of the things to understand. Kingpin's brutal, right? Kingpin, Wilson Fisk, is brutal, he's intense, he will kill whoever he needs to kill. I mean, this guy has almost no morality whatsoever when it comes to dealing with anybody who is a threat to his empire. However, he is an honorable man, and I know those two things seem to run in contradiction with each other. How can you be amoral and be honorable at the same time? It's just kind of the nature of Kingpin, but he is an honorable guy. When he makes a promise to you, he will keep it. It doesn't mean he won't kill you after, but he will keep it. And so he made this promise to Peter. Fine, I will owe you a favor. And so what he does is he presents him with information that will say this will not give you the exact location, but it will get you on the trail to Norman Osborn. Now, the reason why this is so important is because at the end of Superior Spider-Man, the Superior Spider-Man had basically cured Norman Osborn of his Green Goblin persona, right? Wiped the slate clean. It was a way for Dan Slott to kind of get rid of all that stuff and then just sort of start over, kind of write the story in a different direction, which worked. It was really, really cool. But in effect, Norman Osborn was no longer bound by the insanity that came with the Green Goblin persona. The belief of Superior Spider-Man was that with that being done, Norman Osborn would no longer be a credible threat. The funny thing is he's actually more dangerous now than he was when he was the Green Goblin. And so the crazy thing is that getting on the trail, they ultimately end up realizing, yep, this is Norman Osborn's location when they come across the Goblin Army. Now, the Goblin Army was in effect the army of Norman Osborn, right? I mean, it makes sense. It was one of these things that Marvel was toying with at the time, where it was kind of like what if Green Goblin had his own variation of like the Joker serum, right? And that instead of making people crazy and they basically laugh themselves to death, they end up becoming his henchmen, right? What if it worked that way? That was the whole thing about the Goblin Serum, right? The Goblin formula, if you want to call it that. But at the end of the day, of course, finding these guys here, they're kind of like, yep, we're in the right spot, right? We're in the right location. Now, ultimately, this invisible person is basically planting charges outside of what is, in effect, this kind of base of operations for the Goblin Army. And when a couple of unsuspecting people, right, who just kind of wander over, right, curiosity killed the cat, they're kind of curious about what's going on, when they walk over and they're like, what in the world is this? And then one of them's like, hey, go grab that thing and bring it over to me. This person's like, no, nobody touched these things, right? And even go so far as to shoot in the air to distract anybody, right? To get everybody just kind of running away. And so picking back up with Spider-Man, Mockingbird, and all these guys, they end up coming across the guy who's basically kind of running the show here. And I hope I'm getting this pronounced correctly. I believe I am. El Fasoquero, I think is how you pronounce this. So this guy is basically the one who's running the show here and just kind of shooting everything up, right? Just kind of going nuts. Apparently it stands for the Warthog, I guess. Whatever the case is, this guy is kind of the main boss in this part of the world or this part of the country. And so essentially, while this whole big battle is going on, Spider-Man looks at this guy and immediately believes he's Norman Osborn, right? It's like all arrows point to the fact that this guy is Osborn. We'll talk about what those arrows are here in a second. But before anybody can really do anything, this invisible person topside basically detonates these charges and blows up the entire area. And so this essentially leads to the Warthog, if you want to call him that, basically disappearing, right? Just bailing, getting out as fast as he possibly can. Spider-Man and Mockingbird have to bail as well, but Spider-Man chases after this guy, right? He immediately goes after who he thinks is Osborn and manages to like literally chase him down, right? Manages to track this guy down and then capture him, right? Now, the biggest issue about this is while Spider-Man is convinced this guy is Osborn, when they wash out through the sewer drain, they end up out in the muck, right? In the garbage pit. He's like, both of you are crazy. I am not Norman Osborn. And then once you switch over to SHIELD HQ, it's confirmed, right? This guy's fingerprints, his voice, his face, he's not Norman Osborn, right? None of this really makes sense. And so it almost kind of looks like Peter Parker's basically losing his mind. At that point, you switch over to the Countess of Delvadia and you find out that Norman Osborn is alive. And Norman Osborn looks like this guy. And the reason why, and this is actually a genius maneuver, what Norman Osborn has been doing to both discredit Spider-Man as well as throw him off his trail is Osborn has actually been having facial reconstructive surgery to replace his face with criminals from the criminal underworld across the world itself and just with people in general. It's what keeps Spider-Man from being aware of the fact that he's alive or being able to tangibly locate Norman Osborn. And it's one of the smartest things that a person could have possibly done, because you got to think, if Parker Industries is a global industry, right? They've got all kinds of tech and resources at their disposal. You have to assume facial recognition has to be one of those. Vocal recognition has to be one of those, right? All that has to kind of fit in. And that while Norman Osborn still maintains the same voice, walking around with a different face and just not really saying anything to anybody, or if he does, that he can kind of talk low enough or talk in a place where any kind of Parker vocal recognition wouldn't pick him up. It is a little kind of conspiracy theory, but when you're a major villain trying to escape a major superhero, it kind of makes sense that you would go to those lengths. And so in the aftermath of this, you end up learning that what Peter Parker's been doing has actually been using Parker Industries different, meetings or different charitable events and things like that, hosting them in different locations based on where the perceived location of Norman Osborn is, and then using that as a means to investigate. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, at the same time though, it's also kind of a terrible idea, because if every time Spider-Man shows up, a Parker Industries charity event happens to be going on at the same time, somebody somewhere is going to put two and two together and say, why is it that Spider-Man's always in the same location where there is a Parker Industries charity event? This dog don't bark, man, right? Somebody is going to have enough sense to know what's going on. And so at the end of the day, they all end up kind of going through it, right? They're heading to Hong Kong, essentially. But before they do, Peter Parker kind of deviates for a second, ends up going to hang out with Aunt May. A lot of that's just because of Dan Slott kind of telling the story involving the extended, cast members of the Spider-Man comics themselves, which it is kind of cool, right? Seeing Peter Parker hang out with Aunt May, he hasn't really seen her for a little while. Harry Osborn, of course, and Betty Brant have have a kid. For those of you guys who don't know who Betty Brant is, she was the first girlfriend of Peter Parker. His first real true love was Gwen Stacy, right? After that, it was Mary Jane Watson. But ultimately, he kind of brings them all along. He's like, hey, everybody, let's go. Let's all go to Hong Kong, right? One, because of the fact that Aunt May's basically in charge of like the Uncle Ben Charity Foundation, right? Harry Osborn has his role in Parker Industries. So as it being a kind of big, huge charity event, they all kind of need to be there anyway. But hey, who's never looking for a good excuse to go to Hong Kong and just hang out? I'd go there for the food. Not even gonna lie, right? The food would be like my main motivation for going to Hong Kong. I love Chinese food. But having said that, once they get there, of course, they start going through and investigating, kind of looking through everything, so on and so forth. Their trail kind of, again, leads them on this path of finding out where, or at least sort of, hopefully locating where they believe Norman Osborn is. The problem with this is that, again, Norman Osborn seems to kind of be using this identity of El Fasaquero. Now, again, the big issue with this is that Peter Parker and them believe that Norman Osborn is this guy, which temporarily he is. They don't know that Norman Osborn is using facial reconstructive surgery. And so in their mind, there have been 5 sightings of this guy across the world, and they're basically hunting all of them down. What's keeping Norman Osborn ahead of Peter Parker is that by the time they get to the point where they realize that this El Fasaquero is just an identity used by Norman Osborn, he's already on to his 2nd, 3rd, 4th identity. So they'll always be 3, 4, 5 steps behind him in terms of trying to track him down. Again, that's the genius of all this. That's what makes Norman Osborn so incredibly good here. And so ultimately, once they end up grabbing one of these henchmen, they find some pumpkin bombs, and like, okay, basically everything here, right? These goblin gliders and all this stuff, this all screams of Norman Osborn, right? So tell me where this guy is at. And ultimately, he's not initially dumping the information, and then things start to get kind of heavy-handed, right? Like Mockingbird's kind of like, hey, I mean, look, we could kill you, just know, we could kill you, right? And nobody would know. I mean, nobody would know that you're dead, right? You'd just be at the bottom of the water somewhere, or maybe we just put you in the cement wall and cover it up. Obviously, they're not going to do that. But when you're a henchman in the criminal underworld, hell, anything's possible. And people that you thought were good guys turn out to be bad guys, right? Because there's anti-heroes that do terrible things all the time, the Punisher being an example of that. And so the fear of this is enough to get this guy talking. And he basically dumps and says, okay, look, there's supposed to be like a great big huge event going on, right? Where they're basically going to be showcasing like all these weapons and things like that. And it's all going to be done kind of underground as part of the Uncle Ben Foundation, right? Like it's going to be part of that event. They're using the Uncle Ben Foundation as a guise to showcase this stuff, which is a pretty crappy thing to do, which again kind of sends Peter Parker into disarray because for him it's just a personal offense, right? Disrespecting the memory of his Uncle Ben. Now, while that goes on, you have Norman Osborn with a fake face who looks over at basically Aunt May, and it's kind of like, what are the chances that I could have a face-to-face conversation with someone? She'd never recognize me, but let's go talk to her, right? Let's go kind of see what's going on. Now, behind the eyes of Norman Osborn, the wheels are turning. And that if Aunt May is here, of course he knows Parker's here. Because remember, Norman Osborn knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. More so than that, depending on how things go down, he can use Aunt May, right? Kidnap her, something like that, hold her for ransom, whatever the case happens to be, because he knows Spider-Man will do anything to save the life of Aunt May. The problem is that as he gets closer, suddenly you've got Betty Brant, who refers to herself as Betty Lyman. Suddenly you've got Harry Osborn, who says, hey, like my last name's not Osborn anymore. My last name is Lyman, right? Harry Lyman. And that's when Norman realizes his son is there, right? Not only is his son's wife and his son's kid, right? So he's kind of like, wow, okay, so after everything I handed you, you changed your name to your mother's last name. Now, here's the reason why this is so important to Norman Osborn, right? And it's one of the things we've probably never really talked about over the course of the various videos that we've done about his character. Norman Osborn, depending on how you look at it, was either a great father or a terrible father. He was a great father insofar as he ensured that Harry Osborn never wanted for anything. He always had a great education. He always had whatever he needed to succeed in the world. He was a bad father in the sense that he was never there emotionally for his son. He was never really there in a supportive capacity beyond simply just giving him things. And so because of that stuff, it created a kind of rift between Harry and Norman. And in fact, Harry Osborn, being tired of being ignored by his father, switched the chemicals in an experiment his father was conducting, which is what led to Norman becoming the Green Goblin in the first place. So literally, Harry turned his father into the Green Goblin. That kind of guilt went on for years regarding Harry once he learned the Green Goblin's true identity, and in fact is one of the reasons why Harry ended up adopting the Green Goblin moniker himself. But the important thing here is that the relationship between the two is exceedingly tenuous. But for the most part, Norman looks at his son and says, I gave you everything, right? And this is how you repay me, by changing your last name, by casting aside your birthright. But at the end of the day, while all that's going on, this invisible person is yet again returned, standing on a rooftop, and they were basically looking to do the exact same thing that Peter Parker and Mockingbird were doing, which was locate Norman Osborn and find a way to take this guy out. Now, granted, this person on the rooftop would do it with violence, right? Like executing the guy from, a block away. Spider-Man and Mockingbird are not looking to kill him. They're looking to snatch him up and then basically throw him in jail, right? That's really all they're really looking for here, or at least to find some way to tie the criminal actions he's been engaged in to Norman himself and then use that to throw him in jail. And so ultimately, Spider-Man gets the upper hand on this invisible person, manages to take her out, and then uses his sonic webbing, right, his electrical web tech to basically take out the stealth tech, and then we end up finding out that it's Silver Sable. Now, I know some of you guys would be like, Silver Sable? Really? Like the most lackluster unmasking ever, right? Like the whole Scooby-Doo gang catches up and they rip off the mask and they're just like a random person, right? And it's just, I get that it might be a little lackluster here, but here's the thing. Silver Sable was believed to have been dead. And in fact, the way the story arc with her playing out was that she was supposedly died in the collapse of a building. You actually end up finding out that somebody called the Foreigner had basically given her a android body to kind of operate as her double out there in the field. So she is very much alive. She's just kind of recovering from all of her injuries. So that's why her android version is more or less here at the moment. The reason why she's here is that she's an information broker, right? That's what makes Silver Sable so significant. She's a person that brokers information and can basically get you anything you need to know on seemingly anybody. She's very similar to the heroes for hire, right? Misty Knight, Colleen Wing, Shang-Chi, those guys, but she's just a lot more capable. And a lot of that's because she's been around for much, much longer, and she's been operating on a much larger scale for much longer. So she's got contacts all over the world, right? She knows pretty much everything going on in the world at any particular point in time because she can just get that information from somebody. And so the ultimate thing behind this is that in the midst of all this chaos, when Spider-Man attacks Silver Sable and the gunshot goes off, people start fleeing for their lives. Norman Osborn appears to Harry Osborn, but it really just does it for the purpose of saying like, yes, I'm alive, right? I'm alive and I'm here, right? I mean, obviously his face is different, but Harry picks up on his voice, right? And it's really just one of these things to say, I'm very much alive. I'm not dead. You just need to know that, son. And then immediately takes off to basically launch his weapons presentation, or at least his tech presentation to all these different guys. Now, the crazy thing about this is that, of course, this basically leads to an alliance between Silver Sable and Mockingbird and Spider-Man. The biggest problem that you have here is what's going on right now is in effect like a giant fight. Essentially, Spider-Man is not a person who has like political asylum, right? Like he's not supposed to be here. So launching an attack against anybody in Hong Kong, being an American citizen, S.H.I.E.L.D. immediately like, we can't be here, right? We cannot be a part of this. Like S.H.I.E.L.D. is, at the end of the day, a US government organization. And so if Mockingbird is there, who is a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, alongside Spider-Man, launching a strike against somebody like Norman Osborn, who most likely has found a way to gain Chinese citizenship, even if it's only under false pretenses, then what it looks like is the United States government by way of S.H.I.E.L.D. and a superhero are launching an attack against a Chinese citizen in Hong Kong. That is a international rights disaster, right? It's the last thing anybody needs. Stuff like this is how wars get started. And so immediately Nick Fury's like, Bobby Morse, we can have nothing to do with this. Back out, right? Get out of here. And ultimately she ends up falling back, right? Because it's a direct order from S.H.I.E.L.D. If she had said no to this and he would have said, fine, right? You're disavowed. He would have cut her off. And if anybody came asking any questions like, why was Bobby Morse a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent in Hong Kong with Spider-Man fighting a Chinese citizen, regardless of whether it's Norman Osborn or not? The response of S.H.I.E.L.D. would be, we told her not to. And as soon as she went with it anyway, she stopped becoming a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent. Do with her whatever you want to, right? She's not our problem anymore. They would cut her off, right? They would basically leave her out to dry. And so, of course, again, this kind of leads to this sort of alliance, whereas Peter Parker and Silver Sable, who continue on this path, going across and really attacking and trying to find a way to capture Norman Osborn. Now, while that's happening, that's when Norman Osborn basically kicks off the stream, right? Now, the stream was only given to a select few people, and it was kind of an access code or website on a bit of a business card. And so, of course, Harry Osborn took one from one of the crazy dictators that were out there. And so you have Norman Osborn kind of putting on this show for everybody in terms of, here's what our technology is able to do, right? Spider-Man and Silver Sable chasing after him was designed to lead them into a trap. The whole point was like, literally, he takes off, he ends up coming down, and they follow him right to where they're supposed to be. And when that goes down, the whole perception is that, as far as they're concerned, that it was a demonstration of like the Goblin glider, right? The next generation of like the Goblin glider, so you can fly around and it's got weapons and different things like that, right? Pumpkin bombs and so on. And it seems very just kind of hackneyed, right? Where it's just one of these things where Peter's like, I mean, look, man, like this is your weapons show, right? Like Goblin gliders and pumpkin bombs. And the response of Norman is, no. That was never what we were showing. Like we're not presenting gliders, things you could sit on and fly. That's not not what we're showcasing here. And then you have the Countess who steps in, and again, we don't really know a whole lot about her, but we'll learn about her here in a minute. She steps in and she says, no, what we're here to display is the Kingslayer Mark I. Literally, this enormous mech suit. You end up having this really interesting fight going on between like Peter Parker, Silver Sable, like the Kingslayer Mark I, and ultimately they're able to take it out, right? Like ultimately they're able to destroy this thing using a combination of Parker technology, you know, EMP, all that kind of stuff, shock, you know, shock tech and all that kind of stuff, what you would basically expect. I mean, it literally happens over the course of like 2 pages, right? And it's literally like one page they're fighting it, the next page they've won. Like it's not a great big huge long drawn out battle between this thing, but you end up getting a bit of a background here. And what you end up learning, and the reason why Silver Sable is here, is because the Countess is basically a person who is operating out of a place called Simcaria. And Simcaria is a nation where, of course, as most people who are familiar with Silver Sable know, that that's where she comes from. What the Countess had done was allied herself with Norman Osborn and then basically subjugate the population and turn the entire country of Simcaria into what is in effect a weapons manufacturing plant, right? Literally everybody there just builds weapons. That's all they do. And the purpose comes twofold. One is so Norman Osborn can build up his presence in the criminal underworld scene, because as we know, the biggest motivation of Norman Osborn over the course of his life prior to becoming the Green Goblin was to rule the criminal underworld. After becoming the Green Goblin, it was killing Spider-Man and then ruling the criminal underworld. And so kind of regaining his bearings, sort of going back to basics in that way, it was basically Norman Osborn working alongside the Countess to build up all these weapons and then sell them off to the highest bidders to make himself kind of the guy that people go to whenever they need a way to fight off some kind of enemy force or to conquer a country or to maintain their control over a country. The second thing that's going on here is that Norman Osborn is basically creating an entire goblin army in Simcaria, right? Like literally flying these fumes over the whole city and creating an enormous goblin army. And so the response, and really what kind of goes on here, is you basically have Harry Osborn, you've got Aunt May, who's brought in by S.H.I.E.L.D., right? You've literally got like Bobby Morris, who's talking to Nick Fury, and it's kind of like, look, I get that we're not necessarily supposed to be there, but you guys have to understand what Norman Osborn is doing out here is, one, a violation of human rights. So who knows how many human rights laws he's broken, and two, he's going to become a massive, credible threat to S.H.I.E.L.D. itself. And so ultimately Bobby Morris ends up going on this mission. Now the problem with this is that it's not sanctioned. Nick Fury's still not behind this. He's like, no, like we're not getting involved there. And so quite literally Bobby Morris basically forms her own kind of small band team, right? Which is pretty cool, right? I mean, they basically call it the Wild Pack, but nonetheless, the thing about this is she's like, I resigned from S.H.I.E.L.D. She's like, this is something that's more important, right? I can't just idly sit by and let this happen. More so than that, Bobby Morris has grown to care about Peter Parker, right? She, dare I say, she kind of loves him, right? She believes in him, right? And it's one of those things where literally Spider-Man's talking to her and he's like, thanks for doing this, I owe you one. And she's like, well, I've worked with you long enough to know whatever you're doing here, you're doing it for the right reasons. And he's like, oh, you believe in me. You know, she's like, okay, now you're making it weird. But obviously there's a kind of romance blending between the two, right? Obviously there's feelings developing there. And so launching and, you know, kind of making their move into Simcaria, one of the other things that's happened too is that Norman Osborn has kind of gotten back his original face. The big problem with this is that he's all kind of grotesque looking. And the reason why, as it's explained to the Doctor, who he ultimately turns into one of his goblin members because he doesn't have a use for him anymore, is that the human face can only go through so many surgeries in such a short amount of time, and the muscles don't quite have a chance to recover. So in effect, Norman Osborn has screwed up the muscles in his face, and that's why his face looks all screwed up. And so because of that, he's kind of grotesque and twisted. And when Spider-Man, Silver Sable, Mockingbird, when Wild Pack, when they all get into Simcaria, they end up going against these Kingslayer Mark Is as well as the entire goblin army, which is kind of nuts. Now, a combination of spider tech, Silver Sable basically getting back here and actually kind of returning to being a champion of the people and freeing her people from the clutches of the Countess, it all sort of comes together and it sees them literally just crushing this goblin army. Now, the big difference here between the goblin army as it previously existed and the goblin army as it exists now is that in years past, again, when the goblin army initially showed up, it was people in suits, right? It was people who were dressed up, people who were designed to look like goblins. What Osborn's done here is he's physically changed the appearance of people to look like goblins, like quite literally changed their physiology to turn them into actual goblins. And that's what sort of sends Peter Parker up the wall, because he's like, my God, like you literally screwed these people up. Like, what have you done? And that's when Osborn kind of reveals that the Goblin Serum was always his greatest invention. And then what he intends to do is quite literally put this Goblin Serum in a nuke, fire it into the atmosphere, and then basically create a world of goblins, right? Like his own personal goblin Goblin army, which of course, as we know, can't stand for that. And so once this happens, right, with a nuke basically being launched into the air, right, a missile flying out there somewhere, it's all hands on deck, right? So this really becomes kind of the crisis moment here. So it really kind of boils down to a combination of Silver Sable facing off against the Countess, right, to basically be the one to rule Simcaria, which this has whatever symbology and whatever meaning you really want to assign to it. It's not really all that important. The real meat and potatoes of this comes down with Peter Parker facing off against Norman Osborn. Now, that's one of the things to keep in mind, is that historically speaking, when it came to the Goblin formula under Superior Spider-Man, that the way it was done, Norman Osborn cannot become the Green Goblin anymore. The Goblin Serum doesn't work on him anymore. And that's exactly what happens here. That where he tries to inject himself with his newest strain of the Goblin formula, it doesn't work, right? Nothing works. That he basically can't defeat Peter Parker the way that he traditionally would. More so than that, the kind of gas that he emits around Spider-Man basically robs him of his spider sense. The other part of that is that he intends to kind of boil this down to really more of a one-on-one fight, right? That by robbing Spider-Man of his spider sense and then in turn using what is essentially a kind of EMP to rob him of any of the tech built into his suit, that is just a knockdown, drag-out fight between two guys. It's even in the playing field. And this is a pretty significant moment here, because the truth is, and while this really could have been more of like a big event, I'm kind of glad that it was confined down to just being a singular story involving Norman Osborn, that this is basically Peter Parker facing off against Norman as they are, right? There's no web shooters, no none of that stuff, right? It's simply just Peter Parker, the guy where his powers are seemingly gone, and then Norman Osborn is just a guy, right? So they are 100% on an even keel here. For Peter Parker, it's personal, right? Norman Osborn is synonymous with the death of Gwen Stacy. And so in a lot of ways, defeating him, like finally taking him out, is a way to kind of avenge Gwen Stacy herself. And so the fight like literally leads out into the snow on the side of a mountain. I mean, this is just a hardcore fight between these guys. Now, the big problem here is that, again, while all this is going on, the missile is firing, right? The missiles are flying, right? I mean, they're just out there. And Norman Osborn is getting the upper hand on Peter Parker. Now, that's one of the funny things about this, and it's one of the things that Dan Slott kind of plays with, and it's one of the things that not every Spider-Man fan was receptive to, right? What this does is put forward this idea that without his proportional strength of a spider, without his web shooters and his enhanced agility, Peter Parker's useless. There's nothing he can do, right? He has no real skills whatsoever. This flies in the face of the fact that Peter Parker learned his martial art the way of the spider, right? Like he literally learned a martial art style taught to him by Shang-Chi. And that Norman Osborn doesn't really have a particular martial art, right? He's not really fighting using Kung Fu or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's not like he was trained at the hands of the Gracies, right? It's just one of these things where he's just a guy and him and Peter Parker are involved in a bare knuckle fight. A lot of Spider-Man fans looked at this and said, no, this fight never should have happened this way, right? It should have been Peter Parker just overpowering this guy. Even if he only had just, standard strength of like of an adult, he has a martial arts style. He should know how to overcome, counter this guy's moves. Now, in the midst of all this, essentially the missile suddenly stops, right? The missile is basically caught by what was, the friends of Spider-Man, right? Mockingbird and those guys basically bring it to a halt. They end up catching it, right? So it essentially gets deactivated and the formula never gets spread. In that momentary distraction, Peter Parker gets the upper hand on Norman Osborn. And again, the fight kind of continues on. That's one of the things that I liked about this. It wasn't really one of those small little kind of like, well, it's a momentary distraction and then it's like one punch, done, right? And then he's like, let's get back to the fray. It's not like that, right? It's a momentary distraction, gives Peter Parker the upper hand, and then they're right back into it again. Now, in the midst of all that, then it's also like the arrival of S.H.I.E.L.D., right? Now, when that happens, when Peter Parker's distracted, Norman Osborn bails, right? He takes that moment and just gets out as fast as he possibly can, right? He just runs because he knows that if he stays here and he fights Spider-Man, that the fight is going to go on long enough to where neither one of them is really going to win. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s forces are going to show up, they're going to snatch up Norman, and Norman's going to be taken to jail. The smartest thing for him to do is bail out. The other part of this is Nick Fury's like, look, I applaud your all's desire to do the right thing, but let's be honest here, right? By coming into Simcaria, which was rightfully ruled by the Countess, and having Norman Osborn as her aide, by defeating her, you've basically toppled a government, and S.H.I.E.L.D. cannot be a part of this, right? It will not be said that S.H.I.E.L.D. helped Spider-Man topple a lawfully run government, right? A lawfully recognized government. No, we're not helping you overthrow foreign powers. So he's like, S.H.I.E.L.D. wants nothing to do with this. He's like, so from here on out, S.H.I.E.L.D. has nothing to do with you, Spider-Man. We are completely and totally severing ties with Parker Industries, right? You guys are cut off. We are no longer in bed with each other, which is kind of a smart move, to be honest with you guys. But Parker Industries comes in, of course, provides resources, different things like that to help these guys out. But the other follow-up to this, and what really kind of comes out of this and really leads into the return of the Green Goblin, is Norman Osborn reflects back on his fight with Peter Parker, all these various schemes that he's been involved involved in, and comes to this realization that the only time he ever came close to defeating and even killing Spider-Man is when he was the Green Goblin. And so in his mind, he has to find some way to get the Goblin formula back. The funny thing about this is Norman's going to go to some pretty desperate measures to make that happen. The problem is, once it does happen, how it becomes deadlier, really worse than he ever was, right? Just this really twisted and sadistic version of his character, probably leading into one of the greatest stories that Marvel's ever written involving the Green Goblin. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.